speak, your grace.
Wine exploded across the marble floor. Ladies screamed. Guards rushed forward. The
Seize
Duchess
her at
pointed
once.
furiously at the trembling girl. "Seize her at once!" But before anyone could move, the old physician knelt
has a
beside
strange
the
aroma,
spilled
not
drink,
from-
dipped
Yes,
in a silver
the bitterness
test
is
spoon,
unmistakable.
and the metal turned black before everyone's eyes. Poison. A deadly silence swallowed the room. The Duke slowly turned toward his wife,
could you betray
and the
me?
color drained from her face.
You will pay
How
for
did a
this.
servant no one respected uncover a plot that nearly destroyed the richest house in the kingdom? And why was the Duchess already smiling before the cup fell? Stay with us until the end, and please subscribe to the channel, because this story only gets darker from here. That moment at the ball did not begin with poison. It began weeks earlier, on a gray November morning, when Myrelle Dane arrived at the servants' gate of Evermere Hall with worn leather boots, a folded letter of reference, and a mother too sick to leave her bed. She had not come seeking fortune. She had come seeking work honest enough to buy medicine. The housekeeper, a narrow woman named Mrs. Potts, looked Myrelle up and down with the indifference of someone inspecting a piece of furniture. No warmth, no greeting, just a list of duties recited like a sentence. Floors by dawn, linens before breakfast, candles trimmed before the Duchess descended each morning. Myrelle accepted every word without complaint, said thank you, and was handed a plain gray apron. That alone made her unusual. The other maids warned her quickly, in hushed voices between chores, to become invisible. Do not linger near doorways. Do not catch the Duchess's eye. The best day inside Evermere Hall was the day you went unremembered. She learned why on her third morning. A young footman had forgotten to polish the base of a silver candelabra in the dining room. Arabella noticed, not at dinner, not even at breakfast, but at the precise moment she chose to make an example of him. She held the candelabra to the light, turned her gaze on the boy, and dismissed him without raising her voice. That quiet fury was worse than shouting. He carried a month of wages and nothing else out of the hall before noon. No one spoke for the rest of the day. Myrelle kept her eyes on the floor, but she felt the silence press into everyone's shoulders like cold water. The Duke was different. She first saw him on a Tuesday, descending the east staircase before most of the house had stirred. He moved quietly for a man his size, carrying a cup of black coffee he had apparently poured himself, rather than summon someone to bring. He stepped carefully around two maids scrubbing the corridor on their knees, not through them, not past them with impatience, but around them, with deliberate attention to where their bucket sat. He said nothing. He did not smile, but he set his empty cup on the side table himself, rather than leave it on the floor for someone else to collect. Myrelle stored that somewhere careful inside her. Later that week, she saw him quietly double the coal ration for the kitchen staff without announcement and speak to the stable master without condescension about letting the older grooms rest through the coldest morning hours. He was not warm, he was not open. There was something sealed inside him, something that had been closed for a long time. But he was not cruel. Inside Evermere Hall, that distinction meant everything. By the end of her first month, Myrelle had come to understand the nature of the place she had entered. The food served at the Duke's table was extraordinary. Pheasant glazed with dark plum reduction, bread that filled the back hallways with the scent of honey and yeast, wine arriving in bottles sealed with crested wax. The silver shone, the ceilings soared, but the people living beneath those ceilings were either frightened or entirely alone. And wealth, Myrelle had learned by then, was not the same as goodness. Arabella Evermere was most dangerous when she was being admired. Myrelle understood this slowly, the way you understand something that has always been true but takes time to trust. In public rooms before guests, the Duchess moved with a particular kind of grace, laughing at the right moment, lowering her eyes with practiced humility, pressing a gloved hand to her chest when something touched her. Society adored her. Charitable committees sought her name. Visiting ladies left Evermere Hall calling her a treasure. Inside the manor, after the carriages departed, she became someone else entirely. Mirelle was sweeping the upper corridor one evening when she heard Arabella's voice carrying through a partially closed door, not raised, but edged with something cold. A young housemaid named Bet had placed fresh lilies in the wrong vase, or perhaps the right vase in the wrong room. The distinction barely mattered. What followed was not scolding, it was dismantling. Arabella spoke to the girl as though naming every inadequacy she had ever carried, quietly, precisely, without pause. Bet emerged a few minutes later with dry eyes and a hollowed expression that was worse than tears. She handed in her notice the following morning. Mirelle said nothing. She had not yet earned the right to speak. But she watched. She watched the way Arabella burned letters in the small sitting-room fireplace on Thursday evenings, feeding them one at a time rather than in a bundle, as though each one required its own private destruction. She watched her dismiss the accounts-keeper and insist on reviewing household finances personally, then seal those records in a rosewood cabinet to which only she held the key. She returned from the jeweler's without the pearl brooch she had worn for years and told the Duke it had been misplaced. The older staff knew more than they admitted. One evening in the kitchen, while bread cooled on iron racks and the cook poured herself a small glass of elderberry wine, Mirelle listened as the older women spoke in the careful way of people who had decided some things were safer as whispers. They said the Duke had married Arabella after years of carrying a grief no one fully understood, a woman he had loved before, lost to illness, and never fully released. He had chosen Arabella for her stillness, her composure. He had mistaken control for calm. Once she became duchess, the composure remained only when it served her. What she resented most, Mirelle gathered, was the legal structure of the estate. Tristan held the titles, he held the trust arrangements. Without him, Arabella's access to the fortune she had grown accustomed to was considerably narrower than she had anticipated when she married into the Evermere name. She had spent years managing that frustration through purchases, through social influence, through selling pieces from the old family collection quietly enough that no inventory ever caught it. It was never enough. Lord Cassian Vale began appearing at Evermere Hall in October, always with an invitation, always at Arabella's specific arrangement. He was the kind of man who wore his charm deliberately, like a garment chosen for effect, handsome in a rehearsed way, quick to laugh, and careful never to stand too close to the Duchess when others were watching. But Mirelle noticed the moments between the performance, the way Arabella's shoulders released when he entered a room, the way their conversations ended too abruptly, the words cut short precisely when a servant drew near. One afternoon, Mirelle was collecting unused tea things from the blue parlor when she heard Cassian's voice through the adjoining wall, low and amused. She could not make out the full words, but she heard Arabella laugh in a way she had never once heard her laugh with her husband. That evening, straightening the Duchess's writing room, Mirelle noticed the rosewood cabinet sitting unlocked for the first and only time she could remember. She did not open it, but through the slightly parted door she saw the edge of what appeared to be a folded legal document, a column of figures, and resting beside a stack of letters, a small silk-wrapped object no larger than her palm. She stepped back, closed the room, said nothing. But the shape of what she was beginning to understand settled into her chest like a stone dropped in still water, and she felt it long after she had returned to her room and blown out her candle. The Winter Charity Ball was the most important evening of Evermere Hall's social calendar, and Arabella had begun preparing for it with an intensity that unsettled everyone who worked near her. Lists multiplied, instructions arrived and were revised and arrived again, floral arrangements were ordered, rejected, and reordered. The kitchens were given 3 separate menus before a final one was confirmed: roasted pheasant, a consommé served in bone china, spiced pears in red wine reduction, almond tarts dusted with sugar so fine it dissolved on the tongue.
Cases of imported wine arrived in the cellar, catalogued and arranged by Arabella herself rather than the butler, which Mr. Reed, a composed man who had served Evermere Hall for over 2 decades, noted quietly but did not challenge. What occupied Murrell's attention was the speech. The winter ball always opened with a formal address from the Duke, a brief welcome to assembled guests, judges, clergy, bankers, families of old title. Arabella had never previously shown particular interest in this tradition. This year she had raised it 3 times in a single week, once pressing Tristan at dinner to confirm he would speak before supper rather than after, and the second time arranging with Mr. Reed that the ceremonial wine goblet be presented to the Duke precisely as he rose to address the room. Her reasoning sounded unremarkable. Tradition, she said, proper form. But her interest in the timing felt exact in a way that had no innocent explanation. 11 days before the ball, Murrell was sent to the blue parlor after 10 in the evening to replace burned candles on the writing table. She entered quietly with fresh tapers in her apron pocket. The room appeared empty. She moved to the far table and had just lifted the first spent candle when she heard voices from the adjoining antechamber, separated from her by a heavy curtain and a door left open by no more than 4 inches.
The plan is
She
set.
recognized them both.
No one
She did
must
not
know.
move.
I understand.
The words came to her in fragments, some clear, some lost beneath the low crackle of the parlor fire, but there were enough. Once he drinks and rises, no one will suspect. By morning, everything changes. And then Cassian's voice, quieter. The trustees will have no grounds, not if it appears natural. Murrell stood with a cold candle in her hand and did not breathe. She heard them move toward the door she had entered through and pressed herself behind the tall writing cabinet until their footsteps receded down the corridor. She remained still for a long time after the silence returned. When she finally stepped forward, she almost placed her foot on a folded piece of paper that had slipped from the writing table, or perhaps from a coat pocket. She could not know. She picked it up with 2 fingers. It was a half-written note, the handwriting precise and familiar. It listed names she recognized as trustees of the Evermere estate, and beside certain names, figures, and beside the figures, a single date, the date of the ball. She folded it and placed it inside the hem lining of her apron. For 2 days Murrell told no one. The calculation was plain and brutal. A maid accusing a duchess was not a witness. She was an accusation. She would be dismissed before the sentence left her mouth, and whatever she knew would be buried with her employment. She needed to be useful at the moment it mattered most, not silenced before it arrived. Instead, she watched. She studied the wine service, who handled which bottles, at which stage from cellar to table. She learned that the ceremonial wine goblet used for the Duke's formal toast was kept separately from the general service, stored in a locked side cabinet to which the butler held the key, and that Arabella had asked Mr. Reed twice about the preparation of that particular vessel. 3 nights before the ball, working late to press table linens, Murrell passed the service corridor where the ceremonial silver had been laid out for final polishing. The goblet sat among the pieces. She leaned close. The smell reached her before her mind had formed the question. Bitter, faintly herbal beneath the clean metallic scent of the silver, like something dissolved in liquid and allowed to dry. Not wine, not polish. She straightened slowly and carried her linens back to the pressing room. She did not sleep that night.
The ball arrived the way great occasions always do, loudly, brilliantly, with no patience for the private fears of those required to serve it. By 7 in the evening, Evermere Hall had been transformed into something that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances. Hundreds of candles burned in the chandeliers, casting the grand ballroom in warm amber. The musicians played from the gallery above, something stately and unhurried. The smell of the kitchens reached even the entrance hall, roasted meat, caramelized fruit, warm bread, the faint sweetness of almond from the dessert tables already being laid in the adjoining room. Guests arrived in a procession of dark coats and jeweled necklines. Laughter collected in corners. Glasses clinked. Arabella stood at the Duke's side near the entrance, welcoming each guest with the precise warmth of a woman who had rehearsed sincerity for years and made it indistinguishable from the real thing. She wore a gown the color of deep sapphire. Her composure was extraordinary. Cassian Vale arrived among the honored guests and greeted the Duke with a firm handshake and a wide smile. He greeted Arabella with perfect social correctness, nothing excessive, nothing observable. He moved into the crowd and began working through it with practiced ease. Muriel moved through the same crowd from a different direction, carrying a tray, wearing a face she had deliberately emptied. She had no proof that would survive a formal accusation. She had a folded note in her apron and a smell she could describe but not display. She had the memory of a voice through a curtain, which was nothing in a court and less than nothing before a crowd of aristocrats. What she had, finally, was the certain knowledge that the goblet on the silver service tray near the head table had been prepared by someone other than Mr. Reed, and that in less than an hour the Duke of Evermere would be asked to lift it and drink. She watched from near the service corridor as the butler carried the ceremonial tray into position. She watched Arabella glance once at the tray, then away, with the involuntary satisfaction of someone checking something they had already arranged. Then Mr. Reed was called to the door to settle a dispute between two arriving coachmen, and the tray sat unattended for less than 3 minutes. It was enough. When Tristan Evermere rose to speak, the room gathered itself into the expectant hush that power commands without asking. He was not a theatrical man. He spoke plainly, without performance, and the room respected him for it. He lifted the goblet. The candlelight caught the silver. Muriel was already moving. Later, she would not remember deciding. She would only remember the ballroom floor beneath her feet, the rows of shoulders parting without understanding why, the heat of the candles, and then her own voice tearing out of her chest with a force that surprised her. "Don't speak, Your Grace!" Her hand struck the goblet before he could register her face. The wine left the cup in a wide arc and fell across the white marble in a dark stain. The goblet rang against the floor. For 1 full second the room did not react. It simply absorbed the impossibility of what had just occurred. Then it erupted. Ladies pressed backward, men stepped forward, voices crossed each other in outrage and confusion. Arabella's composure fractured into fury with remarkable speed. She pointed at Muriel, who had fallen to her knees and stayed there, trembling, and her voice cut above every other sound in the room. "Seize her at once!" Guards moved, hands reached. Muriel did not run. Mr. Reed's voice came from somewhere behind her, steady as iron. "No one touches this girl until the physician has examined that drink." The room hesitated. Reed was 70 years old and had served this house before half the guests present had been born. His authority in that moment was not official, it was simply undeniable. The physician, who had been standing near the far wall and had already moved forward instinctively, knelt beside the spilled wine. He produced from his coat a small silver testing spoon, the kind that had been used in this kingdom for a century to detect the most common poisons of the nobility. He pressed it into the spreading liquid. He straightened slowly. The spoon was black from bowl to handle. Nobody spoke. The musicians in the gallery had stopped without instruction. The candles continued burning with complete indifference. In the silence, the only sound was the faint settling of the fire across the room. Tristan Evermere set down the empty air where his goblet had been and turned toward his wife. Arabella's face did not change expression, but every drop of color left it. For a moment, Arabella simply stood in the ruins of the evening and chose not to believe they were ruins. Then she began to cry. It was not the crying of a woman caught. It was the crying of a woman deeply wronged, and she produced it with considerable skill. The trembling lip, the pressed hand to the mouth, the disbelieving turn to face her husband as though she too were a victim of something monstrous. She said Mirel had been erratic for weeks, said the servants had always resented her, said anyone with sense could see what was happening, a jealous, desperate girl planting a false accusation against a woman she had always envied. Several guests shifted uncomfortably. A few faces in the crowd showed the beginning of doubt. Arabella was, even now, extraordinarily convincing. Then Tristan asked one question. His voice had none of the performance that surrounded him. It was simply quiet and precise and impossible to look away from. "Why did you arrange the wine service yourself?" Arabella's tears did not stop, but something behind them shifted, the way ice shifts at the moment before it gives way entirely. She said she had simply wanted the evening to be perfect, that she had handled it personally out of care, that such dedication was being used against her now, which was the cruelest. "Mr. Reed," the butler stepped forward. Reed confirmed, without drama and without pleasure, that on 2 separate occasions the Duchess had inquired specifically about the ceremonial goblet, that she had personally handled the service cabinet on the evening before the ball, and that he had discovered the preparation of that particular vessel had not been completed by any member of his staff. The room absorbed this in silence. Cassian Vale had been edging toward the corridor near the south wall for several minutes, moving with the controlled casualness of a man who understood crowds and knew how to leave them. A guard stepped from the doorway and blocked his path with a hand on one arm. Cassian laughed briefly and said there had clearly been some confusion. The lever fell from inside his coat when the guard caught his arm more firmly. It did not fall far, and it landed open. Mr. Reed retrieved it. He read the first 2 lines, said nothing, and handed it to Tristan. The handwriting was Arabella's. The letter referenced the estate trustees by name, outlined the terms of the inheritance should the Duke die without a revised will in place, and ended with a line whose meaning was unmistakable to anyone reading in the context of an evening that nearly ended in the poisoning of the man who held the title. "Tomorrow begins as planned." Arabella stopped crying. What replaced the tears was not guilt, it was rage, genuine, uncontrolled, and somehow more honest than anything she had shown in years. She told the room that she had been a prisoner in a loveless house, married to a man made of silence and distant grief, entitled to a life and a fortune she had earned through years of performing the role of Duchess while her husband remained emotionally absent. She said Cassian had only offered her the understanding Tristan had never once provided. She was not wrong about all of it. Tristan listened to every word without interrupting. When she finished, the room was utterly still. He gave no speech. He simply looked at her for a long moment with an expression that contained too many things to name, and then he nodded to the guards. Both Arabella and Cassian were taken into custody by the Crown's officers before the supper hour. The ball dissolved without ceremony. Guests retrieved their coats and departed in lowered voices, the evening's violence of revelation sitting heavily on them all. Mirel was still kneeling on the marble near the stain of spilled wine. She had not moved. She was shaking with the particular exhaustion that follows the release of something long and tightly held. She expected to be thanked briefly and sent to her room. She expected perhaps a week's wages before dismissal. She had spent a maid's capital tonight, every invisible quality that kept a servant safe, and she knew it. Tristan crossed the floor to her. He did not gesture for her to rise. He crouched to her level, which was not what a duke did, and he looked at her directly. "What do you want? Tell me honestly. Tonight, before all of these people, ask me for anything you need." Mirel looked up at him. "Medicine," she said, "for my mother, and honest work." The guests who had not yet reached the door heard her. A woman near the back of the room began crying quietly. A judge who was about to leave instead removed his hat and held it against his chest. Nobody spoke. The months that followed moved the way genuine change always moves, not in a single dramatic gesture, but in small and steady accumulations that one morning simply look like a different life. Arabella was stripped of her title before the Crown's Council. The investigation that followed revealed the extent of what she had quietly removed from the estate over the years. Old paintings, silver pieces, a set of emerald jewelry that had belonged to Tristan's grandmother, sold through a jeweler in the city who asked no questions. The recovered funds were returned. The disgraced pieces were catalogued. Cassian Vale was imprisoned, facing charges that would keep him confined for several years. Society, which had admired Arabella and accepted Cassian, absorbed these facts with the particular silence of people who had been entirely fooled and were not comfortable saying so. Evermere Hall itself changed in ways that had nothing to do with legal proceedings. Bet came back, the young housemaid who had been hollowed out in a doorway and left the hall without a reference. She knocked at the servants' entrance in January, uncertain of her welcome. Mr. Reed opened the door himself, told her there was a position if she wanted it, and had tea made before she had finished removing her coat. 3 other former staff returned within the month. The kitchen grew louder. The back corridors, which had always been held in a particular anxious hush, gradually filled with the ordinary sounds of people working without fear. Tristan was different. Not unrecognizable, he remained a quiet man, not given to speeches or demonstrations, but something in him had been forced open in the events of the winter ball, and having been opened, it seemed unable to close again. He began appearing in parts of the estate he had previously left entirely to others. He sat with the estate accounts himself. He learned the names of workers whose names he had never known. He asked questions about the village that ran along the southern edge of his land and began to attend to the answers. He asked Mirel, not as a formality, not in the manner of a man requesting a servant's input for appearances. He asked genuinely about how the household felt, about what the staff needed, about the charity arrangements that Arabella had publicly championed but privately neglected. She answered honestly because he asked honestly. It became a habit before either of them remarked on it. He visited her mother. He arranged it quietly, without announcement, sent his personal physician to the small house where Clara Dane had spent the winter in a narrow bed with insufficient warmth and inadequate medicine. The physician arrived with his bag and with coal and with instructions to return weekly. Clara improved through February. By March, she was sitting in a chair by the window. Mirel wept the evening she received that news, alone in the small room she had been given in the east wing. She permitted herself 10 minutes of it, and then washed her face and went back to work, because that was what she did. But she understood then with a certainty she had not previously allowed herself that the Duke of Evermere was not performing generosity, he was practicing it. Spring arrived softly. The rose courtyard at the rear of the estate, which had been left largely untended in recent years, was replanted on Mirel's suggestion using the original planting records she had found in the estate archive. By April it was beginning to fill. Old roses, pale pink and deep red, small flowered climbers against the stone wall, lavender planted along the lower border for the bees. The groundsmen gathered there one morning in mid-April, drawn by no particular announcement, simply by the warmth and the smell of it. The groundsmen stood with their hats in their hands. The kitchen women sat on the low stone wall. Mr. Reed stood near the gate with his hands behind his back. Tristan walked into the courtyard with Mirel beside him. He had told no one in advance what he intended. He simply turned to her in front of them all, under the pale spring light, with roses opening on the wall behind her, and he said that Evermere Hall had for too long been a place where worth was measured by birth and title and the management of appearances. He said he had spent years confusing silence for dignity and distance for strength. He said Mirelle Dane walked into his house with nothing but her honesty and her courage, and had saved him in ways that went considerably beyond the evening everyone remembered. Then he knelt. Mirelle looked at him for a moment without speaking. She had not dressed for this. She was wearing her working clothes, and her hands were ink-stained from the records she had been sorting that morning, and she was unprepared in every practical sense for what was happening. She said yes through tears, which surprised her, because she had always considered herself a woman who did not cry easily. The courtyard broke into noise, not the formal, controlled applause of a ballroom, but the unself-conscious sound of people who were genuinely happy and had no reason to pretend otherwise. By evening, the news reached the village. By the following week, it reached the city. Society received it with the mixture of surprise, admiration, and competitive romanticism that such stories always produce in people who have never had to earn anything.